This is the story of a man who could never let go of what was done to him. A man who saw the horrors of what the Japanese army did in New Guinea when they ran out of food. This is the story of the man who tried to put Emperor Hirohito on trial.
Charlie Dogwood.
Hello everyone, today I have another story for you. It's a dark story, as per usual, but this time our main character is perhaps one you might feel some sympathy towards. In fact, you might have even heard of him before. Okuzaki Kenzo, equal parts activist and madman. We'll be going over his whole life today, his time as a soldier, his numerous jail stints, and his time as an activist. Today we'll start with his most important work, his attempt to put Japanese Emperor Hirohito on trial. It all started after New Year's Day, 1969. Let's get into it. For many cultures, New Year's brings parades or parties, but in Japan it means the imperial family will make a public appearance on the veranda of the Choden reception hall. Crowds of public well-wishers would be let into the massive plaza before the Choden and then could cheer, wave flags, and enjoy the view of the imperial family in a rare display of openness. The popularity of the event had earlier caused a stampede in 1954 which took the lives of 16. For most of the 1960s, the practice had been cancelled out of fear that political activists would attempt to hijack the event. But in 1969, they were feeling lucky. They shouldn't have. Amid this crowd, there was a single man drifting about unseen. He was a man like any other in Tokyo that day. The only thing that would have let you notice him was the dark aura that seemed to surround him. However, it was a sad reality that most of the men his age, men of the war generation, all bore that sort of darkness about them. So, he went unseen. The Emperor Hirohito and his family waved to well-wishers from up above, yet for some reason that the Emperor couldn't understand, little metal pachinko balls began to fall at the Emperor's feet. It wasn't threatening, just confusing. Then there was a shout from the crowd. "Yamazaki, shoot the Emperor with a pistol." With how large the crowds were, no one really seemed to pay any mind. No one except for the police, who frantically scanned the plaza for the team of assassins. They couldn't find him. No gunshots were fired. The metal balls stopped falling at the Emperor's feet. It was as though the attempted assassination had never even happened. A sad, defeated man handed himself into the police and was taken into custody for attempting to assault the Emperor. Attempts to find the fellow assassin with the man who had surrendered revealed that this Yamazaki character, who supposedly had a pistol, had died many years ago in the jungles of New Guinea. And with that, the police had fallen into the would-be assassin's trap. He had wanted to be arrested from the very start. That man's name was Okuzaki Kenzo, and he was hoping to do what the Americans never did: put the Emperor of Japan on trial. Okuzaki Kenzo was born in 1920 in rural Japan to a poor family. Back then, if you lived in rural Japan, you either owned land, ran a shop, or were an impoverished tenant farmer. Not a lot else. Okuzaki was lucky enough after graduating elementary school to become an apprentice at a cotton wool wholesaler. He never returned to schooling afterwards. His early schooling had done enough to indoctrinate him, and his work had done enough to teach him how to do heavy labor. So when the draft came for him in 1940, he was a perfect candidate for the army. A good old country boy that could barely read. But he was a bit different from how they expected. In any army, they expect soldiers to follow orders. In the Imperial Japanese Army, where the physical abuse of enlisted men by officers was common and expected, it was even more so the case. The Japanese enlisted soldiers were expected to just take the abuse and get over it. But Okuzaki Kenzo, despite being a perfect fit for the IJA otherwise, didn't fit into this mold. He was too wild and too obstinate to be tamed. The rough and extreme demand of authority in the army had done anything but make him more likely to follow orders. In fact, Okuzaki was known for fighting officers rather than taking the beating like other men. There exists some stories of him simply refusing to follow orders outright, proving that Okuzaki was both incredibly brave and that Japan needed a whole lot of men regardless of their quality at that point. Unfortunately for Okuzaki, he couldn't say no when they shipped him off to the island of New Guinea, the place that would become his hell.
Jungle warfare is a new kind of warfare. It is fought in damp, sapping heat through shoulder-high vegetation that covers the hills and deep gullies. But the United Nations must master jungle tactics if the Japanese are to be torn out of their conquered empire.
Japan had earlier attempted to trek across New Guinea in what proved to be a shambolic attempt at capturing Port Moresby. Of some 15,000 men sent on the 360-kilometer journey, only about 3,000 survived. The Japanese High Command decided to send even more men into the fire. They just didn't really learn from their past mistakes. Not knowing the danger, Okuzaki and some other 140,000 other soldiers were sent off at feted ceremonies. Little did anyone know, but only about 1 in 25 men would come back alive. Starvation, sickness, and enemy bullets, and even cannibalism would take the lives of 135,000 Japanese soldiers. They were being sent into hell. Okuzaki was part of an engineering regiment. When they arrived, they got their orders: build an airbase in the middle of the jungle. New Guinea was a very foreign place for the Japanese, and their military didn't have a proper understanding of the terrain. They weren't used to the sort of jungle warfare that the region demanded. China, Japan, Korea were all far different to the dense jungles of New Guinea. So it's not a huge surprise that when they decided to order the regiment to build an airbase in the middle of the jungle, that they didn't really know what they were getting into. They would need to clear foliage, flatten land, build air hangars, build an air control tower. It was a laundry list of tasks to carry out in the middle of a very dense jungle. Meanwhile, they would be ravaged by heat, by malaria, and worksite injuries. But at last, after weeks and weeks of work, they managed, finally, to finish the airbase. It was then immediately bombed into dust in an air raid. All the work had been for nothing. Now Okuzaki and the over 100,000 other soldiers still left on New Guinea were left without a supply line. All they could do now was scrap together what they could from hidden supply caches left strewn about New Guinea and hope for the best. The Japanese military had learned from the first operation, so that was their solution, just sort of toss supplies around and hope that their guys could find it later on. In an attempt to reclaim these caches, small patrols were formed and were staffed with volunteers. Okuzaki was one of those who volunteered. Now, by taking part in these patrols, you could get the first pick from the caches, but it wasn't a guaranteed good time. It was an incredibly dangerous task, since they were oftentimes tasked with infiltrating behind enemy lines. In fact, on one of these patrols, Okuzaki actually lost one of his fingers. So Okuzaki and his boys did get the first pick of the caches though, so joining the patrols ultimately was probably what saved his life. But for most people, they just starved. It was a slow starvation, a gradual wearing away of the men by the lack of food and tropical illnesses. The strict discipline in the Japanese military allowing officers an easy time, of course. So, the first to die were always those who were enlisted troops, or occasionally unlucky officers. But it was the enlisted who took on the brunt of the danger. After all, they were the ones out doing food runs. These patrols moved far beyond the range of their main units. And as the situation got worse, the leadership quickly began to break down between the main body of forces and the various scouting groups. Okuzaki was no doubt eager to get away from the main Japanese officer corps anyway. So after a certain point, Okuzaki and his men had sort of become disconnected from their main unit anyway. This shielded Okuzaki and his men from the worst experiences that the Japanese had to deal with on New Guinea. And it wasn't until much later on that Okuzaki discovered the full extent of what exactly was going down there in New Guinea. You see, the main units, the officer corps, still held sway. And their level of starvation was even worse. As supplies ran lower and lower, and wild animals began to disappear from the jungles of New Guinea, the Japanese soldiers were going to have to turn to new sources of food to stay alive. Namely the black and white pigs, as the Japanese called them, but really, this was just a nice way to euphemistically say black and white people. They were eating people. The Japanese soldiers began to hunt the native Melanesians and Australians for food. Then they began to eat their own dead soldiers. Then they began to kill and eat their own comrades, with the killings directed by Japanese officers. But while the jungle had saved Okuzaki and the others in their patrol from full knowledge of what was going on, it wasn't an easy thing to go through. Their presence in the jungle, hunting every creature, didn't help. Soon out there it was whatever they could forage, wild pigs, and the natives, who knew the jungle like the backs of their hands. And mosquitoes. These mosquitoes and the dirty water and the food, it all made them sick. They were alive, but very, very ill, and starving. Every day was unending torment, running from the Australians, hunting, getting attacked by natives with poisoned arrows. It wasn't a good time. One of the men got hit with an arrow and had to be dragged to safety. The poison rotted the soldier from the inside out, and in his delirium he called out for Okuzaki to kill him, and Okuzaki couldn't do it. Then there were the wild pigs. They were food, but they were ferocious and they were starving too. So if they came across a sick or injured soldier, they were liable to try and take a bite out of him. The sound of his dying friends, the sight of dead bodies, and the memories of his starving ally calling out for death. Trying to get Okuzaki to shoot him before the starvation did. And his friend Yamazaki dying, it was all etched into the mind of Okuzaki. There in the jungles of New Guinea, Okuzaki made many memories, none of them good. Of the over 140,000 Japanese soldiers sent to New Guinea with Okuzaki, 135,000 died, largely from starvation and sickness. In late 1944, while stealing food from an Australian army camp, Okuzaki surrendered. From his regiment of 1,500, Okuzaki was one of only 6 who survived. For the next 2 years, Okuzaki sat in a POW camp, half dead and half alive. Okuzaki tried to forget about the war, forget about what happened there in the jungle, but it just wasn't possible. The violence that the military had taught him and the experiences from the war had made that violence something that he understood, appreciated, and needed. However, for a brief period of time, things seemed different. He tried to forget. When he got back to Japan, he worked as a coal miner, gathering up enough cash to start his own business selling car batteries and used cars. Now, Okuzaki was a normal guy. He settled down and even got married. But one day, Okuzaki bought some property. The realtor, unfortunately, in reality, was a scammer and ran away with the cash. When Okuzaki caught up with him, he put the man in the hospital. And when he went to visit the man after the fact to apologize for having beaten them, there at the reunion between Okuzaki and the scam artist, he lost his temper. Okuzaki stabbed the man, only once, but it was enough to kill him. Because Okuzaki had refused to apologize or show any remorse, Okuzaki was sentenced to the maximum of 10 years for manslaughter. Whatever normal life he had planned out for himself had been totally derailed. Behind bars, Okuzaki remained loyal to his hatred of authority. He refused to bend to the prison authorities, so he spent most of his imprisonment in solitary confinement. All 10 lonely years. The whole of the 1950s up until the mid-1960s. Alone. Just him and his thoughts. And his memories. Inside he was able to read books and reflect on life, but not a whole lot else. With all this time to himself, Okuzaki was able to craft a new understanding of the world. The scam artist that he had killed was bad, but you can't kill every scam artist. There's just too many of them. But he was part of a wider system, part of a structure. And this system and this structure produces the scam artist, and that's what's worse. At the top of that system was the Emperor. He had ordered so many men to their death as the head of the Japanese army, but suffered not even a single penalty for it. He got away scot-free. And the whole state, even after the war, was still built around him. And for Okuzaki, this was just something that he couldn't deal with. State power, hierarchy, and justice, all of it had to be swept away and replaced with something new, a true democratic system and equality. While in prison, he began to submit petitions to the government. They ranged from demands to abolish the death penalty, the unconstitutionality of the Japanese self-defense force, and even requests to dismantle the emperor system wholesale. Okuzaki likely didn't know this because of how isolated he was from Japanese society at large, but these were all fairly common proposals on the Japanese far left, which had been growing in the country while he had been locked down. The 1940s were effectively an emergency situation, the 1950s were about getting back to normal life, and the 1960s opened up a possibility to question why the war happened and what happened during it. Led forth by the younger generation, the student and youth-led protest movements of the 1960s were the first to really start to reflect on the past 30 or so years of Japanese history. These groups, most of whom were Trotskyites, didn't gel well with Okuzaki's lone wolf, one-man army approach in the first place, but Okuzaki was also not a Marxist. He didn't care about long-winded theories about the capitalist system. His interests were far more simple and more myopic. Why was he sent to New Guinea? And why did so many people have to die? Prison hadn't taught him how to give up his anger. Instead, it gave him the strength to keep going it alone. So when he was released in the later half of the 1960s, Okuzaki returned to his business and his wife as though he never left. But this time, his work truck was covered in political slogans decrying the police and the Japanese government. As the Japanese far left hit their high water margin in 1968, Okuzaki became interested in doing something probably impossible, something that no one else had the ability to do until then. He would rope the emperor into a legal case, and then call him onto the witness stand. Okuzaki could then ask him whatever he wanted about the war. He could, in effect, put the emperor on trial. At least, that was the logic. That's why Okuzaki threw the pachinko balls, that's why he shouted, "Yamazaki, shoot the emperor with the pistol," that's why he surrendered himself to the police. Okuzaki was hoping to create a great spectacle that would force the government and the people into action. Instead, he was quietly arrested for assault. Rather than putting him in a prison, they held him in a mental hospital for several months. It was a sort of late Soviet psychiatry type of situation. Oh, you don't like the Soviet Union? You must be crazy. Oh, you attacked the emperor? You don't like him? You gotta be crazy. Anything to avoid getting the press interested, and anything to avoid a trial. And the press, for what it's worth, basically did not pick up a story. They acted as though it either wasn't very important, or that it never happened at all. Okuzaki, just being incredibly angry and not insane, wasn't diagnosed as having any mental disorders or illnesses, so the authorities instead decided to slow walk the trial. It took more than a year for Okuzaki to even get bail, but then they revoked it, so he ended up staying in prison during the whole trial anyway. The trial was going to be really odd. This is the only time that the Emperor of Japan has been or probably will ever be involved in a court case since the creation of the post-war constitution. It was totally uncharted territory. How or even if the Emperor decided to address the case could have profound effects, even without people knowing about Okuzaki's plans. After all, Emperor Hirohito had never formally accepted war responsibility. In his first private meeting with MacArthur, he had offered himself up on a platter to MacArthur, but MacArthur had refused, rightly reasoning that the Emperor was a stabilizing force in Japan, and the US wanted stability. So the Emperor and other imperial relatives' involvement in the war was simply ignored. And then there was Okuzaki, trying to get a direct admission of war responsibility over 2 decades later. As much as there was an institutional bias against him, there was also a lot going in favor of Okuzaki. Since the 1946 placard incident, where a protester made fun of the emperor with a sign, Lèse-majesté laws restricting negative speech against the emperor hadn't existed. Even still, people tried to do as much as they could to pretend those old laws still existed. In the trial, this was also what occurred, with the prosecution attempting to avoid using the emperor's given name, given that it was considered taboo. Okuzaki and his lawyer took the position that the emperor had to be named, since there needed to be a victim for there to be a crime. The judge actually agreed, but the prosecutors still refused to use his name, saying that they didn't need to clarify who it was since it was a public figure. But that was all a prelude to the big event. Okuzaki was about to call his witnesses. When it came time to call witnesses, Okuzaki made his play and requested that the victim of the crime, Emperor Hirohito himself, to come to the stand. The court didn't allow it. It was just a blanket no. They ignored his long list of pre-written questions, a good mix of questions about the pachinko assassination attempt incident, the war, and a little bit about Okuzaki's time in New Guinea. But, like I said, the court simply wouldn't allow it. The rest of his witnesses on the list were an eclectic mix of veterans, relatives of dead soldiers, and Japanese intellectuals who Okuzaki had taken a liking to. When gathering up those witnesses also failed, Okuzaki fired his lawyer and finished out the rest of the trial representing himself pro se. It's around this time that Okuzaki took his private parts out and flashed the court and then splashed urine on the prosecutors. That's probably why the prosecutors asked for a sentence of 3 years for the assault, despite the fact that the maximum was 2 years. So they asked for 1 year over the maximum, probably because of that whole, urine thing. The judge gave him 1.5 years behind bars, but honestly, I think he probably should have been given 3 years for the whole flashing incident, to be honest with you. The very same day as the sentence was handed down, Okuzaki and the prosecution both appealed to the Tokyo High Court for a second trial, presumably so that they could give him the 3 years. And Okuzaki was probably appealing because he hoped that he was going to get another shot at the emperor on the stand. The second trial of Okuzaki, by the way, was overseen by a trio of judges, and unfortunately, it went very badly for Okuzaki. These judges wouldn't allow the emperor to be called as a witness and try to stonewall Okuzaki. Okuzaki instead shifted tactics and began to attack the contradictions in the Constitution that, on one hand, stated that it was founded on a principle of mankind and rejected any prior laws or orders that conflicted with that principle, but which also had an emperor who was treated, especially in this case, as above the average citizen. The judges just ignored him. They weren't interested in litigating politics. They gave him the exact same sentence as the last judge had, 1 year and 6 months, with credit for time served. His last court that he could appeal to, the Japanese Supreme Court, felt basically the same way. They outright refused to hear the case. His quest to put the emperor on trial had failed. In the post-war era, Okuzaki existed as one of the few political activists outside of hardline communists and anarchists to support abolishing the monarchy. He had the greatest chance of getting Emperor Hirohito to address the war head-on, out of anybody who had tried. But unfortunately, in this case, the Japanese legal system let him down. Okuzaki served out the rest of his sentence, but he had new plans when he got out. He wanted to continue to poke at the imperial family and get involved in electoral politics, this time making a collage of the imperial family's portrait photo and hardcore pornographic magazines. He printed thousands of them and then scattered them all around Tokyo. Though he went on the run after this, he did get arrested and was given 1 year and 2 months for distributing obscene material, which, yeah, technically it was pretty obscene. He even made a run for the upper house of the Diet. He wanted to see if he could change things inside the very same corrupt system that he wanted to destroy. But this also failed. It's probably for this reason that when former Prime Minister Tanaka Kakaue was caught up in the Lockheed bribery scandal, that Okuzaki totally lost it. He put signs on his car saying, quote, "Kill Tanaka Kakaue," in bold letters, and attached a bullhorn to his roof so he could shout political slogans while he drove around town. Talk about really fucking annoying. Holy shit, that'd be annoying. He even had his business's shutters painted with the word Shingun, or Holy Army. This would become a full-on one-man movement, with Okuzaki calling it the Holy Army Equality Forces. His first act was to write and self-publish a book entitled, wait for it, Writing a Book for the Purpose of Killing Tanaka Kakue. It does sound better in Japanese, but I assure you that's what it meant. They tried to lock him up for it, for incitement to murder, but he was let go. Okuzaki's disgust wasn't unique in Japan. People were enraged all over Japan. Hatred towards Tanaka Kakue and the others involved in the case, like right-wing Mabeline fixer and ex-war criminal Kodama Yoshio, had reached a fever pitch. Though somehow Okuzaki wasn't the most extreme person to take action against Tanaka Kakue and Kodama Yoshio. A pink film actor named Maeno Mitsuyasu flew a plane into Kodama Yoshio's home. So he's maybe the only person crazier than Okuzaki in this entire video. Anyway, Okuzaki did allegedly, supposedly, according to a rumor, star in a pornographic film later on in life. I wasn't really trying to find that one, so believe it if you want, or don't. All of Okuzaki's radical political activism did eventually lead to some attention. The avant-garde documentary filmmaker Hara Kazuo had approached to make him the subject of his latest film. Hara had already made a pair of experimental documentaries and hoped that Okuzaki could be equally as interesting as a cerebral palsy victim and a divorcee. Okuzaki accepted the offer, taking the film crew on his quest to find out what happened to some of the men who had went missing and were declared as having died of sickness in New Guinea. The film would become Yukiyukite Shingun, or The Emperor's Naked Army Marches On. So because of copyright reasons and because I think you should go out and watch this film, I'm not going to tell you exactly everything that happens. After the war, when he was part of a group of soldiers formally surrendering to the Allies at a town of Wiak in New Guinea, Okuzaki had heard rumors that officers within his regiment, as the story goes, they had potentially killed 2 soldiers without reason. Okuzaki promised the still surviving family to get to the bottom of it, and ultimately uncovering the depth of cannibalism that the other groups had to resort to during the war in New Guinea. Through the course of the film, Okuzaki becomes enraged and decides to kill several former soldiers, shooting one soldier's son before being arrested. And I really do suggest watching the documentary to get the full story. It's worth watching, it's very interesting. If you like this video, you're definitely going to like the documentary, so check that one out. Okuzaki was sentenced to 12 years in prison for attempted murder. During the trial, his wife died, so after that point, Okuzaki was alone, behind bars, once again. From 1983 until 1997, he saw out the entirety of his sentence from behind bars. Now Okuzaki was even more weird and dressing in white outfits, starring in one last documentary film in 1998. He passed away in 2005 after an illness. And so ended the life of Japan's most controversial political activist. One might say that his rage made him incapable of pursuing justice. But you could also say that it was the only thing that could propel a broken man like Okuzaki forward. Not long after his death, his home was demolished and replaced with a parking lot. The burial lot for him and his wife was also removed, and its new location is unknown. It was as though Okuzaki had never been there, as if nothing had ever happened. Ironically, that means that at the Choeden reception hall, where Okuzaki made his gambit to put Emperor Hirohito on trial, the bulletproof glass that the imperial family now appear behind is the only possible reminder of Okuzaki Kenzo. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed, please consider subscribing, liking, commenting, and sharing the video. Also, feel free to check out my Twitch and Stream VOD channel. All links are in the description. Also, check out Charlie Dogwood 2 for even more content. Check out this video, it's pretty good. Good stories only. Thank you.